the former National Security Advisor and former Foreign Secretary of India, Shivshankar Menon's new book, Choices. Shivshankar Menon, thank you very much for joining us for this
Thanks for
chat.
having me.
There's enough literature in the public domain, statements by former ministers, the letter that Atal Bihari Vajpayee wrote to the Americans when India exploded nuclear devices in '98, which suggests that China looms large in our calculus on these matters. You have devoted the opening chapter of your book to efforts that India has made, pretty much going back to the 50s, to finding some kind of an amicable settlement to the boundary issue. You've traced the tortured history from the 50s, the 62 war, the long period when there wasn't much happening between India and China, and then of course breakthrough visits of Rajiv Gandhi, and then the 1993 Vajpayee as foreign minister, then Rajiv Gandhi, and then of course the 1993 the agreement that Narasimha Rao ushers in, which is the Peace and Tranquility Agreement, which establishes a mechanism, as it were, for ensuring that nothing untoward happens on the boundary. It would seem, and I'm playing the devil's advocate here, that in the broad sweep of history, if you consider the kind of choices that confronted India on the India-China boundary issue, right? So the kind of initial swap that the Chinese leadership proposed to the Indians in the late 50s and early 60s, Eastern-Western sector stuff, and then of course what's happened more recently, in particular since the SR, the Special Representative Mechanism, started. BPAT, the BPTA seems like small change. I know that you've captured the kind of angst that many in the bureaucracy felt at giving a certain sanctity to the LAC. What does this mean for the legality of India's claims? Today, that seems. It seems like a. I was left wondering, why would anybody in the MEA have been so upset about that, given that today
we are victims of our own success in a sense. See, the BPTA worked, but if you think of it, within 30 years of fighting a war on the world's most disputed boundary, the largest boundary dispute in the world, both countries signed a legally binding agreement to respect the status quo and to settle whatever differences they had through peaceful negotiations. That's a big step. And it certainly was a big step for us. In 1962, Parliament had passed a resolution that we would get back every inch of territory that was Indian. This agreement in '93 said, without prejudice to the stands of both sides on where the boundary may lie, and that we'll continue discussing that, we will respect the LAC, etc., etc. I think that's a big step. And it was a big step when it was taken, which is why we had to undergo the kinds of internal consultations politically with the opposition leaders, with everyone in the build-up to the agreement. Now that it's worked and kept the peace, and if you look at it, it's actually our most peaceful border. Of all the borders we have, it's the least defined, but it's the most peaceful. Then now everyone says, yeah, but so what? Wonderful, but we take it for granted. It wasn't like this. And frankly, it could have been much worse, because this is, after all, a disputed boundary. And as both sides increased their capabilities, moved up towards the boundaries, and came into increasing contact with each other, as had happened in 86, 87, in Sumdurungchu, in Wangdong, the possibilities of things going wrong were really quite high. So the agreement was important at its time. But once it's successful, then you say, yeah, of course. It's like Columbus and the egg. It's in hindsight, it looks simple and easy.
Right.
But I think it was quite a brave political step at that time. And there was a certain concatenation of circumstances which helped.
And it also, in a way, unlocked the India-China relationship, right? In the sense that as long as you were prisoner to that uncertainty.
And it also did another thing. The boundary until then was central to the relationship. Everything used to depend until the Rajiv Gandhi visit in '88. When you finally said, we'll discuss the boundary, but we'll also won't let it stop the development of the rest of the relationship. But if you look at it, the salience of the boundary issue today in the relationship is very low. Your issues with China today are different from those issues of those times.
Right.
Today it's really about an expanded definition of both your interests, of you're rubbing up against each other in the periphery, which you both share. It's a very different situation from, I think, what used to obtain. And I think this is proof that with creative diplomacy, even something very big like a boundary dispute, and with all the emotion that it arouses on both sides, look how well we've managed it. I think actually it's quite a success. The fact that you can ask your question shows what a success it has been.
And yet elements of the Peace and Tranquility Agreement remain incomplete, unimplemented. In particular,
there is more to be done. In fact, it's interesting. I was talking to friends in the army the other day who retired, people who worked together, and they were saying we need to take the next steps because we need to now also make sure that face-offs, we have standard operating procedures, ways of handling face-offs and confrontations and so on in areas where both sides think it's on their side of the LAC. But they say we need to take the next steps because to even prevent even the likelihood of that happening. And I think it can be done. The agreement, 93 agreement itself provides for mutual and equal security. And if we use that as a principle, an idea which actually Mr. Vajpayee, who was then in the opposition, suggested when we were in the process of negotiating it, and which then Prime Minister Narasimha Rao took on board and said, yes, put it in. And if we can build on that, I think there are ways of moving forward and actually strengthening peace and tranquility.
One of the important elements of that agreement, perhaps it wasn't part of the formal text but emerged subsequently, which is this idea of exchanging maps. That remains incomplete for the crucial sectors.
I think the Chinese declared fear is that once you fix the LAC as a line on a map, that's going to become the boundary. And both of us say
which was the Indian fear prior to even...
but it's still the Indian fear. Neither side is satisfied with the status quo as the boundary, converting the status quo into the boundary.
Right.
So I think that neither side actually wants to do.
Right.
And frankly, if there's no trouble, the last death on this boundary was in 1975 at Tulumla, and that was by accident in the fog. So I am not sure that, there is what you used to say in Tamil, it's not a head-going matter. It's not something that's about to...
You make an interesting observation in the book where you say that you note the relatively slow progress in resolving the boundary settlement. And you mentioned that this is because both India and China believe that time is on their side. And you're saying it's not clear who's right, but as long as they do so, progress won't happen. And then you also offer an analysis of what happened in 2014 when President Xi comes to India and you have an incursion happening, very embarrassingly timed for Mr. Modi and I would say for the relationship, but one which Indian policymakers I think still haven't got their heads around in terms of what this ultimately means. You lean towards those who believe it was a testing of or signaling to the Indian side that look, we take our claims very seriously. If that is indeed the case, and if there is an element of adventurism in Chinese thinking, this doesn't augur well for...
well, the alternative augurs even less well. If this was, as some people choose to think, rogue operation, some local commander who decided
where the president didn't have full control.
And if to do that when a president is visiting, that suggests, really, for me, that is much more worrying. The thought that, at any time this thing could explode because somebody has a bad day and decides that some local commander has... That, for me, is a more worrying thought than that I'm dealing with an organized state which is trying to signal, which is using every possible way to try and manage and handle this relationship. And I would rather make that assumption and then draw whatever conclusions and deal with it. And so far, my experience at least, dealing with the Chinese since 1974, is that it is a coherent state. And it is a very centralized, organized state, and especially in the use of military force, even at the height of the Cultural Revolution, when, internal order was not so good. Even at that time, there were very strong controls on the military and on the use of force. And so I have very little reason to believe that this just was accidental or some rogue action.
Why would you discount a third option, which is the Chinese trying to tell the Indians that, look, we both need to get serious about this. They were, after all, dealing with a situation where, I don't know how long Mr. Modi had been in power, but it had been a few months. He hadn't yet even announced who the special representative would be. There was no indication of what the Indian thinking of the new government was.
Well, if it was meant for that, then you would expect them at table to come with something.
Okay.
And it's been 2 years since.
Right.
And it hasn't happened. So I actually mentioned that as the third possibility. But I think after 2 years of no new proposals, no pressing for a settlement, no real progress towards a settlement, I think one can probably rule it out. But of course, we're not in the room. And I haven't been in the room for 2.5 years now. Almost.
You chose to focus almost entirely on the Border Peace and Tranquility Agreement and not on the SR.
Because I'm not writing about India-China relations. In fact, all these 5 instances, I'm writing about the choices that government makes. In fact, the book was more about the process. I was running a study group, actually. And I was surprised by people's idea of how government works and how government makes choices is very limited. And most people actually believe the propaganda, which is that we are eternally consistent, we're omniscient, we know everything, and we're always wise and never make a mistake. Which, of course, cannot be true of any human beings.
But there was a choice. I mean,
but the BPTA for me was the moment when we made a big choice. And it was a moment of major choice. Yes, there were earlier choices, but as I said, I chose these 5 because these were ones that I was associated with in one way or the other, and I saw the decision making.
If I were to put to you that the formulation that emerged through the SR, through the Special Representative's talks on the political parameters and principles, where there's a distinction made between, there's a salience accorded to settled areas, and the opinion of people in settled areas in a sense. Of course, it highlights implicitly that the treatment of unsettled areas might in some way be different. And if, as has happened in the Indian press, with perhaps some encouragement from Indian officialdom, that the reference to settled areas means that this is in some way a Chinese concession, that places like Tawang or Arunachal, there's been a fair amount in the media.
I think
you never said this, obviously.
This is over-interpretation. And Chinese is a very literal language. And it does make a difference which language you think in, actually. I think, in Chinese at least, you follow the letter of the word. And there are many more words in Chinese than there are in English. So the levels of ambiguity in Chinese are actually much less than in English. I wouldn't put all these constructions, because he didn't say something. If he says this, the corollary must be true, and therefore other things. We had an instance of this in 2008, I remember. We talked to the Chinese twice, I remember going to Beijing, before the NSG exemption. And the Chinese said to me, we will not be the ones to oppose you. And we have nothing against India. Which is very well. I came back. And in Delhi, people immediately jumped to the Chinese will support us. I said, no, they haven't said they'll support you. All they've said is that they will not be the only ones who oppose you. Which is a very different thing. It doesn't limit their other behavior, and nor does it guarantee that they will ever support you unless they are the only ones left in the room. Which is, of course, what happened.
That's ultimately how the chips fell finally.
And that's how it worked. Well, that's how it was worked. Let's say. But so I think we need to be very careful in these things. And especially, for diplomats, I think precision is essential. You cannot over-interpret and read and then base your actions on it. I give an example, for instance. We assumed, many of us in India, that because the Chinese withdrew after the 62 conflict to what would have amounted to the McMahon Line in the east and to their claim lines in the west at that stage, that that's all they really want, and that this will be the basis of the settlement in the future. But it never has been offered by the Chinese ever since. And it's very dangerous, I think, to make assumptions out of silence and to extrapolate. So I'd be a little careful on these things.
You mentioned lack of progress in the SRs in recent years. It's been, I would say, for quite a while that We haven't
Well,
heard
I
or seen
would say
anything.
the SRs have served
Yeah.
a very useful purpose,
Okay.
but it hasn't been settling the boundary.
Right.
I think they've maintained the peace on the boundary. They've also done yeoman service for the bilateral relationship, moving it forward. Many of the things that you have now, the strategic economic dialogue and so on, were first discussed, agreed in the SR's conversations. And they've done this strategic survey of the situation around the world, of what's happening in our periphery, what's happening in the world, which has been very useful. Because it's very good to understand where the other one is coming from and how he sees the rest of the world and what he's like.
So you wouldn't accept that it's been a wasted opportunity?
Not at all. In fact, I think it's critical to have a direct, authoritative channel between the top leadership of two large neighbors like India and China, both of which are changing so quickly.
So they haven't served their stated purpose, but all the additional stuff that's been grafted onto it? Yeah.
Their purpose has grown, and I think it's just become more important.
To come back to the formulation you made about time, each country believes time is on its side. If I were to suggest to you that there is when we talk of time being on one country's side or the other, we're talking of the disparities in a way, military, the overall comprehensive national security footprint, the power gap between the two. In 62, when certainly India didn't perceive there to be a huge power gap, we were much more. You have a parliament resolution which says every inch. There was, yeah. But I'm saying the gap is much more today. But at that time, you have a resolution which says every inch must be given back. Today, most Indian, even hard-boiled realists, would love to, fall back on an as-is, whereas kind of an agreement that if only we could go back to the offer that Chow and I made, this may be something acceptable. I want to submit to you that the difference there is an absolute and then there's a relative difference, and that perhaps time is on India's side, because even if the relative gap between the two doesn't close, India's absolute capabilities and any astute Chinese leadership would be looking not so much at what's the difference, but what damage can India do to me. India's absolute capabilities will necessarily be rising. So to that extent, maybe postponing a settlement, maybe the SRs doing other stuff is not a bad thing.
I agree with you, actually, for slightly different reasons, but I agree with you, your basic conclusion that, both India and China today have much more at stake with the rest of the world and with each other. And therefore, frankly, the benefits to them of tension, of any potential conflict, are really minuscule. And it's not going to, I don't see either of them seeing gains out of that, which they might have seen in 62. I mean, the Chinese certainly did. So it makes sense, but it's not just the absolute power or the relative gap or just the perceptions. It's also, once you have stakes abroad and your commitment to the rest of the world is much more than before, you actually have much more to lose. And so it's a combination of all this. Your perception of the future, the need to avoid not just embarrassment but actual damage to your interests. And we can both do serious damage to each other. I mean, that's a fact today. And that's not a good situation to be in. So why would we then go down that road?
Right.
And I think both our countries have shown that, we have much more important things to do. We have to transform India. The Chinese have major jobs of internal change, transformation, adjustment, and reform. So, for me, it's logical that we sort out our differences or learn how to manage them.
Right.
And then we build the rest of the relationship.
The Chinese, the formula that you mentioned in the book, which in a way drives China's policy towards the US, which is its preeminent rival, that they focus on diplomatic, on economic means, diplomatic and military is third, and in that order. Would you say that is a sensible formula for India to also look at vis-a-vis China?
At this stage of our development, yes, I think we should really concentrate on internal balancing, on building ourselves up first.
Do you think we get the order wrong sometimes?
No, I don't think so. I think yes, when people argue about these questions, maybe in the media you hear a lot of but a lot of talk about military options and so on.
Right.
But within government and so on, I've never heard anybody responsible at least, talking like that.
Right.
And if you look at our policy, it's been fairly consistent.
Right. If we were to sum up India-China, the big picture, it would obviously be that here are two powers with an unsettled boundary that decided that we will work on that, but we're not going to let it come in the way. We're going to grow our relationship on every other front. Seems like a pretty good formula if it could apply for India and Pakistan, but it doesn't.
Well, we suggested it to Pakistan in '94 itself.
Right.
I remember Mr. Dikshit as Foreign Secretary suggesting it. But as far as China is concerned, I must add, however, I think that old modus vivendi, which for 30 years kept the peace and helped us to arrive where we are, I think it's under stress now. And I think the signs are clear, the NSG membership, the Masood Azhar listing, there's various little instances, China's sensitivity to what we do in the South China Sea, our sensitivity to CPEC and so on. That's because China has changed, we have changed, and our interests have grown, both of us. And therefore it's natural that we rub up against each other. And I think it's time that we actually evolved or actually grew that modus vivendi, that framework within which we operate. And we need a proper strategic dialogue between the two of us to actually sort that out.
Mr. Menon, thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you for writing this book. And I hope that we will continue to interact for the benefit of readers and viewers of The Wire.
I look forward to that. Thank you
so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, thanks.